Welcome back to part 2 of the many-to-many relationships in Laravel. If you missed the first part, check out the first part before you move on to part 2. In this part, we're going to be talking about attaching data to the pivot table. And this is useful because sometimes there is relational data that is only relevant if two things are in sync with each other. So the example we're going to use is you have a user and then you have a role. But I also want to know who gave that user the ability to perform that action, meaning who was actually responsible for the syncing of that. So that's what we're going to be working on. We're going to add another column to our role user table, and then that's going to store a name. And the name is going to be the name of the person who performed the action to allow that user to perform that role. This is a very common thing to do because a lot of times you'd want to be able to know who granted the permission for someone to do something in your application. So let's work on that now. Let's go to the migration for the create role user table, and let's add a new column here. And we'll say table, and the new column is going to be a string, and the string is just going to be name, as in the person's name. All right. So now let's do a quick PHP Artisan migrate fresh. So we have a nice and fresh database, and there we are. Let's jump to table plus, and of course everything here is empty, except now we have this new name. So how do we do that? All right, it's actually quite simple. Let's continue with the example that we had going on before, this one. Let's comment that out. Let's get rid of this. There we go. All right, so we'll just go back to just using sync. So we have a user. We're grabbing the first user from our database. Actually, that reminds me, we actually don't have a user anymore. So we need to make one now. Let's jump to PHP Artisan Tinker and just make one really quick. Factory, app, user, class, create. Perfect. So now we have a dummy user. Great. All right. So now that we have a user, we're going to fetch that user, and then we're going to attach this role with ID of 3, which actually reminds me, we also don't have any roles anymore. Let's take care of that now. Very quickly, roles, let's just add one, and we're going to say remove users, as that's going to be the role. And of course, that has an ID of 1. So let's go back. Now we can say the following. Instead of just passing in an ID, let's actually use the ID as the key. And we're going to say 1, and then any relevant pivot data is going to go right here. Who performed this action? I will just say Victor. So Victor performed the action of attaching user number 1 to the role with an ID of 1. Great. Let me hit save. Let's go back to Chrome. Hit refresh. And now let's check out table plus. So if we go to our role user table, we hit refresh. We now see that, of course, we attached role ID 1 with user ID 1, but now we have this other data attached. So Victor was the one that was responsible for attaching that together. So that's pretty cool. Now, how do you retrieve this data? Let's go ahead and just comment this out for now. So if we grabbed our user, actually, you know what? We already have it up here. We'll grab our first user. So then we can simply dump user, give me your roles. And if we go to Chrome, there we are. So user roles, of course, we know that the one role that this user has is just the remove users role. But where is Victor? Where is that column? How do I grab that pivot? Okay, so there are actually several ways to do it, but I'll show you the easy way to do it. So we have this users roles. Let's grab the first role. That way we're only working with a single role. Let me show you that in Chrome. There we are. So you see we have a role instance. And the role instance, of course, like I said, is the remove users. So instead of having a collection, now we just have a single role. All right, so now that we have a role, let's just call pivot on that role. And let's check out what we get. Refresh, and there we are. So we have a role. That's pretty cool, right? So we have the user ID and the role ID. However, we're still not seeing that name column. How come we're not seeing that? Well, that's because we haven't told Laravel about this extra data. All right, so to do that, let's go back to our model. This user has many roles. It belongs to many roles, and it does have, with pivot, it does have name. All right, and we're going to do the exact same thing to our other role model. All right, paste. So there we go. Now we've told Laravel, hey, there's an extra piece of data on that pivot table that I want you to grab with you. So let's go back to Chrome, hit refresh, and now There we go. So now Laravel is aware of that name. So now we know that the person responsible for joining these two things together is Victor. Great. In the same manner, if we go back to here, we can just call, at this point, just name. So pivot name, hit refresh, and there we go. That's how you retrieve any additional data from your pivot table. This is very useful, and you can have as many columns as you want. And again, the pivot table is going to hold any data that is only related when those two models have a relationship. So any data that is only pertaining to that relationship is what would go inside those columns. So this is a pretty cool example and just shows just how powerful Laravel and Eloquent is when it comes to databases. So with that, we're going to conclude the explanation of the many-to-many relationships in Laravel. Go ahead and implement that in your application and get comfortable with it. And when you're ready, let's move on to the next episode.